I choose to focus on two things. Firstly is myself, making sure that I'm taking care of who I am by like meeting my basic needs of sleep, movement, and nourishment, and then extending that to my immediate community, and then even taking like a macro step back. There are fundamental changes happening to our society that are so beneficial. There are wins for conservation around the country and around the world, and that's happening because of community action.
That was this week's guest, Wyatt Williams. Wyatt works at the intersection of climate, entrepreneurship, and culture. He lives in New York City and works at the New York Climate Exchange. It's Earth Day, and if you're anything like me, the idea of climate is daunting. It feels like all individual action is meaningless. The idea of a greener future is up in the air, and the younger generations inherited a ticking time bomb. My conversation with Wyatt reminded me that despite a 24-hour news cycle full of doom and gloom, there is still hope and there are still things that we can all do together. No matter where you fall in the climate activism spectrum, I hope that leaning into this conversation and remembering to take a step back helps you in the same way that it helped me. I'm Kyle Cusimore, and this is I Don't Know About You. Hey, Wyatt, thanks so much for joining me on I Don't Know About You.
Hey Kyle, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with some background. So I know you like decently well, but let's give the audience just a little bit of background on who you are, where you're from, and what do you do?
Of course. My name is Wyatt Williams. I am a sustainability-oriented professional, currently living in New York City. I recently graduated from grad school, where I did a dual degree graduate program at Georgia Institute of Technology. My two degrees were a Master of Environmental Engineering and an MBA. Before that, I was a trash consultant. Not that I was bad at consulting, but just that I actually worked with trash. And that was actually so much fun. I'm happy to dive into that in a little bit more detail as well. And then prior to that, I did my undergrad in chemistry as at the Washington University in St. Louis. I am a sustainably oriented professional, and I've always been focused this way. And I think that's because I grew up in rural Jamaica on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and then moved to a neighborhood in DC, went to private school. And so moving from a neighborhood where we were burning our trash behind our house every day to one where my peers were buying houses behind their houses for kids to play in kind of thought me thinking about the equity split and the resources split between the two communities I called home. And I've chose to focus on that resource disparity through sustainability and environmental justice. Currently, I work as an economic transformation associate. I'm directly along those lines of economic transformations and environmental justice at the New York Climate Exchange, a new nonprofit in New York City.
Super cool. Did you have any idea, like growing up, like this is where you were going to end up?
It's one of those things where, again, connecting the dots backwards, you can see somewhat of a straight line, but at the time and growing up and then through and basically until my graduate school, I had no idea where I was going or what I wanted to do or exactly how I wanted to have an impact, aside from the fact I did have an impact. And I had great mentors along the way who really encouraged me to lean into some fundamental skill building that I've been able to apply in the different types of education and professional opportunities that I've had since.
For sure. It's really cool. Like, I didn't know actually your full story, but hearing like, there is like a through line and like everything does make sense in the end. It's just like super cool to hear that. I ask every single guest at the start of the podcast the exact same question. If you could go back to the start of your journey and give your younger self some advice, what would that advice be?
Start of my journey, and I think like there have been so many legs of my journey that have had so many different parts. And I think at each phase I'd have different advice for myself. But thinking even like taking a step back and thinking more generally is to treat every experience and no matter where and who you are as an experiment where you're using that to learn a little bit more about yourself, what you want to do, the impact you want to have, and how you want to enact that impact. And so for myself, that's been through my education, pursuing things I'm actually interested in, and then professionally in the different ways that I've applied that to sustainability in materials, energy, community, grant making, and more.
For sure. That's super awesome. And I think like, yeah, I think we all could like do a little bit more thinking of just some of these experiences as experiments versus just like putting so much pressure on ourselves to just like, get it right every time, like just like learn like through the process. Yeah, I think that that's awesome. Um, let's go back just a little bit. So you said you grew up in Jamaica, you moved to DC. When did like climate like really start to click as like an interest for you? Like when did like your passion for sustainability like really get started?
I think it's the inception, the idea of it as a career has been something that I'm lucky enough to have known as an opportunity. Many of my peers didn't really realize that there is environmental sustainability as a real career path. But my mom was an environmental scientist that worked with USAID before the disaster that's happening right now. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so she was the one who showed me that this is something I could pursue full time if I wanted to. And I chose to focus on materials because that was the thing that was I was really familiar with in Jamaica. Is just the amount of consumables and the fact that we didn't have any formal way to deal with that.
Like it's a very like visual thing. Like the way that you just explained it like in the intro is just like wow, it's like so visual to think like I think like in America, like we frequently are just like, oh yeah, our trash is just going to the street and then that's it, goodbye. But it's like it's such a visual thing when you have to like deal with it like each time.
There's a great article on that very specific topic of throwing something away. What is away by Caroline Ling, and she calls herself the Trash Queen, and she's a consultant at McKinsey. Brilliant thinker on circularity and solid waste. And that's exactly the thing is that we're in the United States and Western countries, there's a place for us to get rid of materials. But when there isn't that, you have to think about why that material is in our life and what we're going to be doing with it after. And it's the cause of very real environmental and health degradation if not handled properly. And so that's been the start of my um, path in sustainability is really thinking, dialing down in the micro of what are these materials. And I did that in my undergraduate research. I was synthesizing bioplastics out of corn. Um, and at that point, I didn't want to keep making plastics. I was like, this isn't the solution. And so moving from that to more of a systems level as a solid waste consultant, that was a really great place for me to kind of expand my experience. And then I chose to broaden my expertise even further from materials to sustainability holistically and what it means to work on sustainability in lots of different contexts. That's what I was able to do in my grad school and since then at the climate exchange.
When you think about early on, like you mentioned, like obviously your mom like was involved with climate work and like sustainability work like early on, but like what did like the first steps of you like having this as a passion and interest, like what did it actually look like for you?
Mm. That is such a great question. It's something I took for granted. Again, I've been put in so many favorable positions for me to do this, and it's also why I feel bad giving advice. Is just say get lucky, like find people who are great mentors,
For
and
sure.
yeah. um, but I grew up like pretty much surrounded by nature, and so being displaced from that in DC, where it was just not as accessible, not as surrounded, and the life and the apparatus of an infrastructure of my environment was so drastically changed that I felt like I needed to put more effort into thinking about what were the major differences between the two communities I grew up in. And again, I pursued that in high school through my classes and thinking about specializing in chemistry, in undergraduate, getting even more specific in chemistry. And since then, I've been able to take even more specific classes at grad school where I was able to, again, work with the social equity and environmental engineering lab on a myriad of different technologies and equity focused research, and then be able to learn and collaborate with community partners who wanted to think about this very specifically in their communities and then generally in the design of similar programs that we could spread nationally. And so several different phases. Apart from that, I just love being in and around nature. So that's something that I can always return to as something that is driving me forward and keeping me optimistic is that we are working to preserve something that is regenerative. So it's very much possible. And if you enjoy being in nature, it's something that you yourself can take steps to be an advocate for, especially when there are people who are working against it in the extent that it exists today.
How does it feel like in this moment to be doing work in climate? Right now it's we've mentioned like stuff with USAID. We've talked about like I mean we don't even need to get into all the different things, but it feels like especially right now it's a difficult space just given everything happening politically, but how do you personally feel working within sustainability and climate?
Well, how do I feel personally? Depends on the day and depends on how I'm feeling. There's another person I follow who speaks eloquently and has works within clean energy. His name is Jigar Shah, and he used to lead the loan programs office under the Biden administration at the Department of Energy. And he, in reconciling the actual fact of like what's happening at the federal level, he takes a 10-day approach where after everything is announced, he gives it 10 days and then seeing what the real
Mm,
impact is. Because there's just so much news and like noise in the space.
noise, especially. Like, it doesn't even
Noise,
matter if it's climate or whatever. I feel like also even getting out of politics, like just our news cycle today is just like so much noise.
yeah, exactly. And so I choose to focus on two things. Firstly, is myself, making sure that I'm taking care of who I am by like meeting my basic needs of sleep, movement, and nourishment, and then extending that to my immediate community. And then even taking like a macro step back, there are fundamental changes happening to our society that are so beneficial, where our life is getting electrified, and that's going to happen anyway. There are wins for conservation around the country and around the world, and that's happening because of community action. So just because there isn't the same top-down 4-year approach and investment doesn't mean that there isn't progress that we can choose to participate in and amplify through our voices. And it's just finding those that are like keep me going and finding the people because there is such a vacuum of like people who want to be working on this and hearing this, and there are places and people that we can tap in and connect to fill that vacuum in ways that are really productive. So I'm optimistic, and it's a weird thing to say, but they can't stop the momentum of what's happening.
And that's like so refreshing to hear just because like it is so doom and gloom, like especially around climate. Like I mean, I have a background like within like education policy, ed tech kind of realm, and like there it's also very doom and gloom. But I couldn't imagine like climate just like hearing all the things like over and over and over again. But like it's refreshing to hear just like a sense of optimism and just like are still like bright spots. There is still like a lot of work happening. Like it's just nice to hear a perspective like that. Transitioning a little bit, you've mentioned the word impact a couple times throughout our conversation so far. What does it actually look like for you? Like, how do you measure or define like your personal impact, and like, how do you feel like impactful like throughout your?
I think that's such a good question. And by the nature of working in sustainability, there are really tangible ways to measure impact, and there are really soft and hard to measure ways. Within my career, I've worked specifically on materials on greenhouse gas reduction within private companies, within municipalities, and within actual specific products. And so that has been somewhere I choose to focus myself. But I'm just a person, and anything I really do won't mean anything in 20 or 50 years unless I have some amazing genius breakthrough, which I don't think is happening. So it really just means, for me, it means how can I empower others to grow their impact within ways that matter? So directing resources to communities that have been historically underserved by the institutes of power, I think is a great way that we can shift the discourse and help accelerate the um, help accelerate the sustainable change. And that's something that I'm able to do through the New York Climate Exchange, which is a network of different academic institutions, private industry players, and community organizations. And so I find like that kind of networking and that kind of work and participation in greater movements as the medium term impact I look to have. And then in the long term, it's just again finding long term ways to channel resources into communities that won't necessarily have the type of investment or priority that others will. For example, we know that tech companies are investing in data centers nationally and internationally, and there are ways that we can work with them to help the communities that they're actually placing these data centers in instead of driving up the prices. And so, to people listening, I encourage them to think about what do you think would be better better for themselves. Again, taking self care as a lens to sustainability for your immediate community and the people you're surrounded with, and then the global community. And that's kind of the hierarchy of how I work. Is you can't really help others if you're not helping and serving yourself first.
It's a really good way of thinking about it because I think like so many people think through climate and like that kind of work just as like, well, how are my actions going to like how is recycling this aluminum can actually going to like help anything. But I think like, yeah, that's a really nice framework to like think through it. You've mentioned equity too. And like, I've heard a lot about climate equity, but do you see equity as being like, I know that it's like a key part of like the work at climate exchange. Do you think it's largely a part of the conversation within climate these days?
Absolutely. And I think, although this may be a hot topic, environmental justice has been a way to focus this type of investment and work, specifically within the EPA. And I like it specifically because of that term as a focus, as we're thinking a way to direct impact in a way that's going to help the most people in the most way for the longest period of time. And the way we do that is by bringing everyone up together. And that means directing resources to places that will have the most specific type of impact. And also, it's been shown that community organizations, when they are participating in these type of projects and given the same type of decision making as the people who are providing the resources and the systems for, let's say, infrastructure development, those projects tend to be more successful in longer term and have higher ROI on the investment put into the project. And so that for me is really encouraging for just the idea that multilateral interdisciplinary work is the most productive and most fruitful type of work that we can use in climate and almost any type of sector moving forward.
We're going to transition just a little bit. I want to chat a little bit about your grad school experience. A lot of people that would be listening to the podcast are probably like, right around the age where they'd be considering grad school and could be a good next step within their path. But I wanted to just hear like a little bit. Like, I know um, you did undergrad in chemistry and then you moved to Atlanta and did grad school at Georgia Tech. What was the experience? What was the experience in grad school like?
For me, grad school was really different than undergrad, where undergrad was more focused on a phase of life and figuring out who I was and studying what I wanted to study in a way that made sense for me, just because I wasn't a writer or artist, that for me was chemistry. And grad school was more about what I wanted to do after grad school. It was putting me in the position where I could get as many useful experiences as skills that I could bring into a sustainability career. And Georgia Tech was an amazing place for that, just by the scrappiness of the students and the people and the research in the labs, as well as the classes that I was able to do. And so I would encourage people to firstly look at the options that are available to them and think about why and what they would be applying and how that would benefit them in the 2, 5, and 10-year timelines. Um, my personal experience was great because I was able to firstly take the classes that I knew would provide me with the skills that I wouldn't have. For example, life cycle assessment and material flow analysis are two techniques specifically in sustainability I still use to this day that can quantify energy, materials, environmental degradation of systems. I was able to get industry and private company experience through firstly my MBA and some of the classes and collaborations I had with industry, and then secondly through my internships. And then lastly, it allowed me to get research and publish on things that I thought merited further investigation in the context of literature, specifically on the adoption of renewable energy, electric vehicles, and environmental justice within grant making. If this sounds interesting to you, I encourage you to investigate it further and think about how it could benefit you in specific ways, but also generally.
I think the thing that's the most interesting, like, and I thought this like from the first time that I met you about how you've approached grad school was the dual pieces of it with engineering and with MBA. How did you kind of go about like that decision and like how did the two like meld together in your path?
Yeah, this isn't something that's done many times at specifically Georgia Tech. Other programs have a more formalized dual degree program, for example, Columbia and Stanford. Um, but I came into Georgia Tech only on the Master's in Environmental Engineering. And then in the first few weeks I was there, I knew that I didn't want to enter academia. I enjoyed my time as a consultant. I knew consulting wasn't going to be my future, but I enjoyed the resources and the action that I was able to experience and participate in private industry. And I learned more about the MBA program and the potential to add on a dual degree within the first few months of there. So I applied, and through that, I've been able to get a platform into private industry that, frankly, environmental engineering doesn't allow you to, where it wasn't specifically on water energy systems, but rather um, private industry as a whole, and thinking about the customers and user experiences of both services and actual physical products. And that kind of holistic focus really resonated with me as like the problems that I had experienced growing up, and I had chosen to investigate as both a consultant and before that in undergrad, weren't siloed just to materials or water or energy. They're holistic. And so being able to bring that focus and that expertise into private industry using environmental engineering was a great fit for me. And it did lead to some great collaborations within the program, bringing people together in entrepreneurship as well as student research, as well as student advocacy groups in specific projects. And honestly, those types of interdisciplinary projects were the ones I had the most success in. For example, we participated in a team that applied for the DOE Solar Decathlon. We ended up winning the single family home decision
Oh,
with
wow.
a design of a net zero energy home in a historically marginalized neighborhood in Atlanta, and they're moving forward with the construction of that home. And so, being able to work on something tangible and real was a real blessing in my grad school career.
That's super awesome. Do you know like when construction's going to be done on it? Like you mentioned that they like just had started on it, but like what is like the path forward on like that work that you've done and collaborated with? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, so we won this contest in earlier 2024, and then we continued the fundraising and permitting through the end of 24. And later this spring, we're actually going to break ground. And by the end of the calendar year, this house is set to be um, finished and then inhabited by people who are unable to normally afford to live in a net zero energy house in this historically marginalized neighborhood of Vine City in Atlanta.
That's super cool. Um yeah, it's just like super interesting. Like I like am wholeheartedly a believer of like interdisciplinary education. Like it's what a lot of my like work in education like kind of looked like, or like even real world project based education. So it's cool that like yeah, you could just like clearly see that in your like grad school experience, like having like entrepreneurship students and environmental engineering students like coming together and just having like a real world tangible impact.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's something that I wasn't able to experience as much in my undergrad, and it's something I wish I had been able to or had the spaces to explore further. And again, what's so exciting for me from my grad school experience, but now at the climate exchange, is being able to bring in community organizations and artists and scientists together for these type of projects. Again, it's one of the things where the parts are greater than than some of the pieces, but it's also just thinking about like the potential of a single piece of work to scale is directly proportional by who and what type of people are working on it. Where if it is just academic research, that like that type of thing will matter, and to expand the bounds of like what's understood about science, about the world, about materials and technology, that can matter hundreds and hundreds of years in the future. But to someone who's in K through 12 education, we need artists and educators who can translate that and demonstrate the importance. And that's where real like transformative potential exists in my eyes.
No, for sure. Because like otherwise, like and academia, like obviously has its place and everything, but it's like gatekeeping a bit, you know? It's like
Hmm.
it's not accessible for like the masses, you know, like when it's just like at that higher level. But like when there's like actual like narrative building and community building like around like these ideas and like getting people involved, like yeah, I think like that's where the real magic happens.
Mm. Stop, 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 stop.
Yeah, one thing that like was interesting hearing you talk a bit, little bit more about like how hands on the grad school experience was. Do you feel like you felt that within your undergrad experience? And like,
Mm.
is that like one of the big differentiators between like how you viewed grad school versus undergrad?
I think there were a few parts of the undergrad experience, some of it more similar to grad school than others. Um, and again, just I went to a liberal arts college, liberal arts-ish college. I was at the School of Arts and Sciences within Washington University in St. Louis. And the one sustainability class I took was a geology class. And so that wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it got me interested in rocks for sure. But I also entered a lab and started doing research. And so getting familiar with the scientific process in a really hands-on type of way was really rewarding to me, but it also showed me that I didn't like doing that type of work, like in a fume hood, setting two reagents to stir and leaving them overnight, and then taking a scan of the product and figuring out what exactly we did and why. Really interesting and gave me an appreciation for that type of work, but wasn't the specific ways that I wanted to have my impact. And that again, going to the idea of experimentation as through experiences was really, really useful for me in determining my short and medium term goals and what ultimately did lead me to grad school, and where I was able to take more of a systems level perspective on sustainability problems and um, that intersection with communities, with technology adoption, and with funding specifically.
We had talked a little bit about for those that are considering grad school, like do your research, like investigate a little bit. If you had to narrow it down though, from your perspective, like who would benefit the most out of a grad school experience?
I think it really depends, and I hate keeping saying that, but I think it's so true. Um, Environmental engineering for me is really fundamental for studying the ways that humans and our society interact with the environment. And so, if that sounds like something that really interests you, and there are many different ways to go about and study that, whether it's through air and air pollution, water pollution, or energy and energy systems. Um, this could be a path that can give you those fundamental skills and then apply them at an intermediate to advanced level, and then put that into practice with the actual systems that matter. An MBA, I think, is a way for people to pivot themselves and their careers towards business, towards management, towards finance, towards the intersection of technology and business as well. And for me, the intersection of sustainability and climate action and private industry. If that sounds relevant to you, where you're not as satisfied with what you're doing right now, if you want a more fundamental understanding of business and administration and management, that could be well suited to you. But more holistically in grad school, it's just if you are curious about a fundamental understanding of things that you think you could bring together and amplify at an intermediate to advanced level, that's, I think, one of the first things that you could be served. And it doesn't really matter your age or your experience or where you're coming from, because you'll find a mix of people in grad school studying a myriad of different problems and trying to apply them in ways that make sense for them.
Who do you think you learned from the most, like within grad school? Like, were there any like specific like groups or um like personas that like you learned the most from, like that you maybe wouldn't have expected to you know have like a bunch of learnings from?
How much time do we have? Yeah, so many. I'm just going to name a
Yeah.
few. Um, Within the Center for Sustainable Communities Research and Education, who sponsored me through a semester of grad school, there are some incredible professionals that were working at the intersection of community advocacy and sustainability research and education. Within my research and within my actual lab, the social equity or environmental engineering lab, or SEAL, which is our acronym, it was my coworkers and my in RPI within environmental engineering. There were incredible chemists who taught me more about like the intersection of air and water modeling and pollution. Then within the Solar Decathlon project, there were people, my peers, who were working in architecture and design or real estate and finance, and everyone brought such a different things. In my MBA, my peers who are coming from army rangers or special forces or entrepreneurs from India who started their own companies. Every single person had such a unique perspective and set of skills that when we applied them together, I was able to deepen who I was. And so that's why I really, really did enjoy grad school.
It's like so awesome to like just hear the breadth of like all the different pieces there. And like where else like would you really get to like collaborate with like all of those different industries like all at once? Like it feels really unique to like that experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I think that's why higher education is such a special place, is that it attracts such a diverse sets of people and puts them together in unexpected ways on such interesting problems, in ways that are really inspiring and create action in the long and medium term. And I think that yourself and your entrepreneurship experience kind of speaks to this too, is like the scrappiness of people and how you can work together to make something beautiful. Kind of reflects that as well.
Founders get it done. Speaking of entrepreneurship, how is it like outside of like working with entrepreneurs? How do you think entrepreneurship kind of like intersects with your path up to this point? You've mentioned it like throughout your MBA process, but Yeah, would love to just hear like how has it intersected to your path up to this point, and like where do you see it like intersecting again in the future?
I think entrepreneurs have such an incredible role within our society generally. Entrepreneurs are able to conceptualize problems and think of solutions in a way that no one has until that point and solve them in ways that and that everyone else will benefit from. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. They wouldn't be taking a risk and going out and starting something new. And so that really matters, especially in climate, where most of the solutions that we're going to be needing to coexist in a meaningful way haven't been invented yet, or haven't been developed yet, or haven't been scaled yet, or haven't been partnered and illustrated and put into practice. And so entrepreneurs are the glue that are going to fill that gap and make it possible to have that civil role. And so I've flirted with the idea in the past of starting my own venture. Specifically within grad school, I was working with a team to develop a company that was creating pet food products out of upcycled oysters from oyster restaurants and oyster farms. And that was really fun, but at one point we just didn't have the capacity or investment to explore this full time, and I chose to focus on others. Within the exchange now, I'm really lucky to be able to work with the amazing startups that are coming out of our 9 different academic institutions and support them in developing and scaling their solutions. In the future, I think I will be returning to entrepreneurship in ways that are going to benefit the communities that I grew up in Jamaica and in places like that around the world. It's just going to take me some time to figure out the niche and method for me to do that.
I can definitely see it like in the future, and I think once the time is right and once you're like ready to like jump, it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be amazing. But let's talk a little bit about NYCE. So give us just a little bit of like, high level explanation about like what the organization is and what is your role within the organization.
So, the New York Climate Exchange is a coalition of universities, private companies, and community organizations um, that was born out of City Grant. And the City Grant has two purposes. Firstly, is to develop a center for climate solutions, research, and education on Governor's Island, which is an island about 400 meters south of Manhattan itself and 150 meters away from Brooklyn. It's 170 acres, and we'll be developing about 200,000 feet of buildings that are going to be the first mass timber building within New York City. It's going to be energy and water positive. We will be generating and recapturing more energy and water than we'll be using. And that's really important for a place like New York City, where it's one of the homes of the built environment, technology, and innovation. And so that is one of our missions. And the other is to support and scale a green or sustainable economic transformation within urban locations and general and globally. And so I work as an economic transformation associate, where I work with our specific partners within universities such as Georgia Tech, where I come from. Again, the New York focus, but also the global reach and more to promote climate solutions and scale those solutions in ways that matter. And so I have been doing that through a battery circularity program. I'm grateful to work with some amazing professionals and researchers at national and globally leading battery institutions in thinking about what are the phases of circularity or types of circularity that we can implement at all phases of battery development and deployment and end of life decommissioning. And so that could look like procurement guidelines, it could look like design standards, it could look like specific chemistries that are more fit for reuse or recycling, as well as the creation of those circular supply chains that are really important because batteries play an incredible role in the electrification of our systems, firstly through electric vehicles, but also in the electrification of our grid and our buildings. And apart from that core mission, I'm also working with our climate tech and entrepreneurship team to support the adoption of solutions within our campus and also our startup community within our partners. Outside of my focus on energy and carbon management, the New York Climate Exchange also works on sustainable finance, on oceans, on workforce development, and on arts and culture. And so everything we touch and everything that we try to promote does have that aspect of interdisciplinary work because we have such an amazing disparate type of experts within our network between the community organizations, between Moody's, BCG, and IPM, the industry partners, and within the university network. We've only been operational for about a year. The grant was released by the city in 2023. We won it early 2024. I started in April 2024 when I was still in grad school. And I've since moved full time as of January 2025. And so I've been able to invest these past 3 months in kind of defining and strategizing for what the next year, 5 years, and ideally 10 years of this program will look like.
It kind of combines like everything that like we've already talked about that you're passionate about, like with this. Like you're getting to like do like real work in the community. There is like a real tangible outcome with like Governor's Island, like you mentioned. And it's not just like research, it's also culture, it's also involving entrepreneurs, it's all of the above.
And I mean, I'm happy to share, like, I first heard about the exchange when I was still in grad school at Georgia Tech. And our CEO, Steve Hammer, was doing a listening tour across the partner academic institutions. And he came in and he told the story about the campus and how the mission of this organization is to do this type of interdisciplinary work and how we can pull in the community organizers, the researchers, the artists and the educators in order to have the type of collaboration that's really needed to cultivate and scale climate solutions. And again, from my background where I had the materials focus and I was looking for something more systems level, and I wanted to have an impact in a way that wasn't yet defined, having a role within this early organization was exactly fit for what I wanted to do. And again, this is why I feel bad giving advice because I got really lucky. And I can't tell people just go buy lottery tickets and you'll be as lucky as I am.
Oh, for sure. Thinking back to the advice that you gave at the very start of the episode, how do you like hold the idea of like experimentation and like being okay with like failing forward? Like how do you keep that like central to the work that you do every day?
That's such a good question, and it's something I wish I could say that I was very good at keeping center to myself because it's so easy to be lost within the minutia of our day to day. But it's something I've been able to realize and work in, especially when I'm working in such a startup organization where we're still defining the processes and infrastructure. And so I'm able to do some of that for myself and thinking about the different roles that I've needed to take because there's been no one else and we just need to get things done. And being able to reflect on what I've enjoyed, what I haven't enjoyed, and what I think could play a role in my future going forward. And I think strategy is something that I was able to study within the MBA, but now real life when I'm having to put that together and think about like real impact at an organizational level has been something that I've very much enjoyed doing. I think will play a role in my future going forward, whether it is in organizational administration and management, or entrepreneurship, or research, or collaboration in the future. And that's just one way, but it's always also great just to set expectations with my team and learning from them and what their skills are, and being able to incorporate their feedback and their guidance on the best ways to get things done because I most of the time uh, don't know it and they have a better clue than I do.
It's always good when you can just like surround yourself with people that you can just like if you're the I don't like to say the dumbest person in the room, but if you're like surrounded by like everyone that's like smarter than you, you're just constantly learning and growing, and it's a really good place to be because you're just pushes you so much further trajectory wise.
Absolutely. And I love being surrounded by the amazing people that are at the exchange. I think the nature of the organization, the position has made us such a unique place for incredible and incredibly experienced people to come and join this with the mission of defining what we're doing. And so I love being the dumbest person in the room. And as a generalist who has this business and engineering and chemistry background, I'm able to apply everything I've learned at like the not at the depth needed, but the depth level to understand. And I allow my peers to take it from there.
Thinking about like your time outside of work, do you still keep time for passions and exploration? And like, what is actually investing in like your passions or being able to explore new ideas? What does that actually look like for you these days?
It's such a great question and something that I really do have to balance because I think that's looked different at different times in my life. Within grad school, where there was the time to explore within formal settings of projects coming to me outside of classes, I was able to pick and choose what I was able to work on, whether that was the research, the grant making, or some of the projects within the MBA that I was able to collaborate on. And now, since moving to New York, it's been threefold. Firstly, getting awareness of the space and the sustainability and climate tech space in New York is somewhat of a part-time job just because there's so many events, there's so many amazing professionals, there's so many different directions that people are moving in, and it's been fascinating and educational to learn about the different avenues and again what the New York Climate Exchange can play in that, but what I specifically can play in that in the medium and long term. It's also been I still have the focus and the collaborations that are coming out of grad school. So whether that is providing more analysis for some of the research partners that we had in the lab, or working on what climate advocacy could look like in my own personal life, um, and then lastly, it's been focusing on who I am and how I want to be spending my free time because it's not always being productive or creative. I'm definitely an extrovert, so being able to allocate and spend time on with my friends and exploring a new city has been actually really rewarding and helping me like keep my own like energy levels and optimism and able to focus on other things as well.
I mean, the whole like you're in New York part of it. I mean, we had a guest a couple weeks ago that moved to New York a couple years ago, and she said it's been like the best thing like for this time in her life to like be in New York, being able to like explore like all sorts of like new interests or like there's just always things to. Yeah, I'm sure. Just like how long have you lived in New York at this point? You said earlier this year.
Yeah, like 2 months now.
Wow. How have the first 2 months been?
Spectacular.
What do you love the most about New York?
The single best thing about New York, in my opinion, is that there's enough foot traffic to support small businesses in a way that I haven't experienced anywhere else in the US, where there's just originality literally everywhere because people can get, if they have something good, people will come.
In general, thinking about whether it's climate or just life in general, what excites you the most right
Oh, I have to say some of the incredible things that are happening within the sustainability space, where people at the highest level are putting the investment and the time into everyone else. And that means that a lot of people are able to bring their global or specific experiences and think about solutions in ways that hasn't been possible before. And the technology is finally catching up to our ambitions of actually decarbonizing our lives and thinking about creating more sustainable systems for us to, again, coexist with nature and with each other. Um, but also it's such an amazing time for arts and culture. Like there's so much good music happening, there's so many good books happening. If you choose to focus on the parts of life that make you happy, there's a lot to think about. And that's
for
good for me.
sure? If you had to speak directly to someone that sees the conversation around climate just as like doom and gloom, like it's just something that like shows up in their Instagram doom scroll, um, what what would you say to them if you could just say like one thing that's like hopeful?
Mm. Self-care is a form of sustainability. And extending that self-care to your community when you have the time and space is climate action. And so being able to move the cycle away from what's being shown to us and think about who you are is the best advice I could give right now.
Wyatt, thank you so much for joining today. This was like such a great conversation, and I hope that like whether people are considering like current climate, grad school, or in general just like feeling doom about climate, like there are reasons to be hopeful, and like I think the way that you've like reframed this like for even myself, like um yeah, it's just like super inspiring. So thank you so much for joining today.
Kyle, it's always a pleasure to catch up. You are such an inspiration for me. And listener, if you don't know who Kyle is, I hope you do, and you're able to research more about the incredible work that he's created from nothing. So thank you for having me. And again, in no place to give advice, but if anyone has any questions or would like to talk further, I'm really accessible. The New York Climate Exchange is an amazing organization. Please reach out to us. We'll always have ways to collaborate.
Thank you to our guest this week, Wyatt Williams, for being a part of this week's episode. You can learn more about the work that Wyatt and his team is doing at the New York Climate Exchange at nyclimateexchange.org. And thank you for listening to I Don't Know About You. I Don't Know About You was created, produced, and edited by me, Kyle Cuzymore, with music by Chris Sambarisi. You can get new episodes each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, please do us a favor and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube for more updates, and rate and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.